Hospitals are meant to be places of safety, bright halls lined with the hum of machines, the steady footsteps of nurses, and the constant reassurance that someone is always watching over you. But when the day ends and visiting hours are over, those same halls change. The lights dim, the corridors stretch longer than they should, and the air grows heavier as though the building itself is holding its breath. It's in these hours after midnight that the hospital stops feeling like a sanctuary and starts feeling like a labyrinth of ghosts. Every closed door hides someone drifting between life and death. Every flicker of fluorescent light feels like an omen. And if you listen too long to the silence, you'll start to hear things that shouldn't be there at all. Tonight's story follows Daniel Foster, a night shift worker at St. Augustine Medical Center. He thought he'd grown used to the rhythm of that silence, until one night proved that the dead don't always stay quiet. During the day, the west wing of St. Augustine Medical Center carried the usual chaos. Wheelchairs squeaking across the linoleum floors, stretchers being pushed in and out of patient rooms, hurried footsteps of doctors whose pagers never seemed to stop buzzing. There were voices layered over voices. Nurses giving reports, anxious families whispering prayers, televisions murmuring in the background with the evening news. But once visiting hours ended, once the lights dimmed and the heavy double doors closed with a hollow thud, the noise disappeared almost all at once. By midnight, the place was a vacuum. Daniel Foster had worked the night shift long enough to recognize the rhythm of that silence. He used to tell new hires that it wasn't real silence, not the kind you'd find in a quiet bedroom or a library. It was a heavier silence, the kind that pressed against the ears, reminding you that you were surrounded by sleeping strangers, some of whom would never wake up again. Daniel sat at the nurse's station in the west wing, stirring the last of a stale cup of coffee. The bitter taste clung to his tongue, but he needed something to push back the fog of exhaustion. The graveyard shift was unforgiving, a marathon that tested not just stamina but sanity. His chair creaked as he leaned back, scanning the corridor. The west wing wasn't large. 8 rooms lined one side of the hallway, their doors mostly closed, dim slivers of light leaking out beneath the cracks. On the opposite wall stood medical carts, 4 poles, and a half-working soda machine that sometimes whirred to life on its own, even when no one used it. 7 of those rooms were occupied by patients stable enough to rest, most under routine overnight monitoring. The 8th room was different. Room 6B. Daniel's eyes lingered on its door, shut tightly with the overhead light switched off. He knew with absolute certainty that it was supposed to be empty. The woman who had been there, Eleanor Ray, 72 years old, admitted after complications from heart surgery, had passed away 2 nights earlier. The bed had been stripped, sanitized, and left untouched since. And yet Daniel found himself glancing toward that door more than any other. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the eerie fact that a once lively room was now just an empty box in the hall, the kind of space that felt wrong in a hospital where every bed was almost always filled. The shift dragged on. Around 1:15 a.m., Daniel completed his rounds, quietly pushing open each occupied room's door, checking vitals, adjusting 4 drips, and making sure every patient was breathing comfortably. He moved carefully, the rubber soles of his shoes squeaking faintly against the tile, the hiss of oxygen machines filling the background. When he finished, he returned to his desk and began writing chart notes, his pen scratching against the clipboard. The quiet was broken only by the occasional groan of old pipes running through the walls, the kind of sound that could be mistaken for someone sighing in the dark. It was then that the night began to feel heavier. Daniel found his eyes drawn once again to room 6B. It was irrational, he told himself, just his imagination trying to fill the silence. Still, he felt that subtle unease creep across the back of his neck, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you know you're alone. He drummed his fingers against the desk. The strange part was, he had always been comfortable in hospitals. Unlike many of his friends, Daniel wasn't unnerved by the thought of death. He'd seen it more times than he could count. Patients passing in their sleep, monitors flatlining while doctors tried to revive a failing body, the slow decline of illness in people who knew their time had come. But this silence was different. It wasn't morning silence. It wasn't relief silence. It was watchful, as if something in that hallway was waiting. He shook his head and went back to his charting. He was overtired, that was all. Too much caffeine and too little daylight would warp anyone's perception. Still, when the building's HVAC system let out a low groan, followed by the faint rattle of vents shifting, Daniel looked up instinctively, eyes flicking again to that closed door. There it was. Room 6B. Dark, quiet, empty. And yet it felt like it wasn't. Daniel tried to refocus, forcing his pen back to the paperwork in front of him. But something inside him whispered that the night was just beginning, and that whatever lingered behind that door wasn't finished with this wing of the hospital. The clock on the wall ticked past 1:45 a.m. Daniel exhaled slowly and rubbed at his temple. The night had only just started, but the West Wing already felt like it was holding its breath. Daniel rubbed his eyes and shifted in his chair, the casters squeaking softly against the linoleum. The West Wing felt smaller at night, as if the walls themselves had leaned inward, pressing closer with a quiet insistence. The scent of antiseptic was sharp in his nostrils, and the low hum of monitors seemed louder than it should have been, carrying the weight of something unspoken. He told himself it was fatigue. Double shifts and constant alertness fray the mind, he reasoned. Yet a prickle ran down his spine, one he couldn't shake. He glanced toward room 6B. Its door was closed as it had been every night. The lock gleamed under the fluorescent light, indifferent and precise. And yet, even from across the hall, Daniel could feel the room's presence pressing against him. The intercom hissed suddenly, a crackling note that made him flinch. "Help!" The voice was faint, stretched thin, almost swallowed by static. Daniel's hand hovered over the button. He had heard hundreds of calls for assistance over the years, but this felt wrong. He pressed the intercom, voice steady. "This is the nurse's desk. Who's speaking?" Silence answered him, only the distant echo of the hallway returning to his ears. Daniel stared at the door. Room 6B. Empty. Deceased. Nothing should be here. Daniel rose, feet dragging softly across the polished linoleum. Each step carried the weight of caution and compulsion. He passed the familiar rooms, noting the blinking monitors, the idle ventilators, the hushed whir of infusion pumps. The wing seemed ordinary, except it wasn't. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light was amplified by his awareness of 6B. He stopped in front of the door. The lock gleamed, untouched. He crouched to peer underneath. Nothing. The linoleum reflected only his shoes. The bed inside had been empty for 2 nights. Daniel's rational mind spun through explanations, misheard signals, crosstalk, a prank. Yet the hair along his arms bristled. He pulled out his tablet, scanning the patient log. Eleanor Ray. DOB March 9, 1957. Admitted March 1st, date of death March 12th. Time recorded, signatures on file. Room cleared. Equipment removed. Everything accounted for. He pressed his ear to the door. A sound, almost imperceptible, slipped out. Not words. Not a voice, but a shallow exhale, wet and deliberate. Daniel staggered back, swallowing. The air seemed to thicken around him. Something about the cadence of the breath, the timing, felt deliberate. Patient? Impossible. Human? No. Yet the evidence, the sound, the pulse of light, the subtle chill in the air, all argued otherwise. The hallway felt alive. The walls breathed. The monitors pulsed in quiet sync with his heartbeat, though he knew it was impossible. He walked a cautious loop, checking doors, ensuring the wing's integrity. Each step brought another subtle anomaly. A curtain shifted despite sealed windows, a linen cart left slightly askew, a faint whisper of movement where nothing should be. Night after night, the pattern repeated. The intercom called, faint but insistent. The monitors flickered, pulses of green light painting the hall. The air grew cold in precise spots, radiating from the sealed room. Daniel documented, he scanned logs, he called biomed techs who found nothing. Everything was normal. And yet it wasn't. One night, he lingered longer than usual. The intercom hissed at 2:48 a.m., a voice indistinct and wet. Daniel froze. His fingers trembled. Something tugged at him, a force he couldn't rationalize, guiding him closer. He stepped toward room 6B, each footfall heavier than the last, echoing in the empty hall. The door, though closed and locked hours ago, now seemed to beckon. He paused at its threshold, hand hovering over the handle. A cold draft brushed his skin, carrying the faint metallic scent of disinfectant and something else. Something he couldn't name. Daniel's pulse raced. He knew he shouldn't enter. Every protocol, every piece of training screamed at him to retreat. And yet, some primal part of him, a mixture of dread, curiosity, and compulsion, urged him forward. The hallway, the wing, the night itself seemed to tilt toward the room, pulling him as if the building were alive, orchestrating his steps. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. The threshold of 6B was before him. Beyond it, the unknown waited. He knew the next moments would test everything he believed about reality. And in the silence of the night, with monitors flickering and intercom whispering faintly, Daniel stepped closer, compelled to confront what lingered where no living soul should be. The night had just begun. Daniel felt his hands trembling as he gripped the clipboard tighter, the paper crumpling slightly under the pressure of his knuckles. The intercom had crackled again, faintly whispering from the supposedly empty room 6B, and the monitor at the bedside, still disconnected, had begun flickering, tiny pulses of green light painting the dim hallway through the slightly ajar door. He knew he hadn't missed any patients, hadn't misread the charts. Room 6B had been empty since Eleanor Ray's passing 2 nights ago. He had been there. He had watched her final breath leave her body. And yet, here was the evidence of life, or something like it, persisting where nothing should remain. He took a cautious step closer to the door, each footfall a muted tap against the polished linoleum. The fluorescent lights above hummed in an uneven rhythm, the buzzing filling his ears like a low, insistent warning. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to retreat, to leave the mystery for the night shift after him. But curiosity, or perhaps a more primal fear, propelled him forward. Daniel paused at the threshold. The air inside room 6B was colder than the corridor, sharp against his lungs. A faint metallic tang lingered, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. His breath formed small clouds, evaporating into the still air. The bed. From the doorway, it looked as though someone had just risen. The sheets were disturbed, subtle ridges forming where none should exist. The indentions, the subtle warmth of an invisible weight, pressed against his mind with unbearable insistence. Daniel's rational thoughts scrambled. Perhaps housekeeping had entered while he was momentarily distracted, though he remembered checking each room just an hour before. Perhaps another patient had wandered in, though security logs confirmed all patients were accounted for. Every logical explanation was swallowed by the undeniable wrongness of the room. His gaze shifted to the monitor. Still disconnected from the wall, yet alive with a jittering green pulse. It skipped rhythmically, then flatlined, then began again. Daniel felt his pulse tighten with each erratic flash. The line wasn't just a visual anomaly, it was a heartbeat. Someone or something was alive in this room. He stepped closer, every motion deliberate, almost painfully slow. His shoes squeaked faintly against the floor, the sound too loud in the silent wing. With each movement, the room seemed to stretch, walls elongating, shadows pooling in corners that shouldn't exist. A faint sobbing reached his ears. Not loud, not sustained, just a single broken exhalation muffled by space and distance, yet unmistakable. Daniel froze, chest tightening. He knew the sound. Eleanor had cried like this sometimes, late at night, weak and fragile, the final remnants of a spirit clinging to the world. He swallowed, forcing himself to approach the bed. His hand reached for the sheets. They felt slightly damp, colder than they should have been. The indent in the mattress deepened under his fingers, though no one was visible. Daniel's heartbeat thumped violently in his chest, yet he continued. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, to abandon protocol. Yet he pressed forward. He had to understand, had to see the truth with his own eyes. Then the sound came again. Not a sob this time, but a whisper. Daniel froze, ear straining. The faintest articulation of words, indistinct, layered over the hum of the flickering lights. The room seemed to contract, air pressing in, thick and suffocating. He stepped back, then forward again, compelled. He could see the curtain at the far corner of the room flutter slightly, though no breeze entered from the sealed windows. The motion was subtle, a soft brushing against the floor. Daniel's rational mind sought an explanation. Equipment malfunction. Optical illusion. Exhaustion. But each step closer erased another fraction of reason, replaced by raw, unfiltered dread. He reached for the curtain and pulled it aside. Nothing. Only the empty bed, sheets slightly rumpled, the pillow compressed as if someone had just sat up. Then the sobbing returned. Louder now. Layered. Coming from the far corner, blending with the faint humming of the monitor, the creak of the bed, and the whispering of the lights. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand, painting weak beams across the room. Shadows danced violently, leaping across walls and ceiling. Daniel's eyes widened. The bed seemed to sag deeper, as if a weight he could not see had returned. He felt the air shift behind him, subtle at first, then insistent, as though something was pressing close to his neck, shoulder, and chest. He spun to leave, heart hammering, when a wet, dragging sound emanated from under the bed. He froze, unable to move. The whispering grew clearer. "Don't leave." Daniel staggered back, finally breaking the paralysis. His hand shot for the doorframe, fingers trembling as he gripped cold metal. His other hand fumbled for the intercom, intending to call for help, but the static hiss that answered made him freeze in new fear. The shadows in the room seemed to twist. The bed shifted again, slight but deliberate. The monitor's pulse synced with the whispering now, steady but unnatural, rising and falling with intent. Daniel's rational mind screamed, "This is impossible. She is gone. She cannot be here." But every fiber of his being knew it wasn't impossible. It was happening. He stepped back fully, pressed against the wall, heart racing, stomach knotting. The whispers and sobs layered into a cacophony, pressing against his ears, against his very mind. The bed's indentation deepened once more, pillow shifting as if someone had just lain down. Daniel's breathing caught, eyes wide, and he stumbled back again. Shadows pooled beneath the edges of the room, crawling slowly like ink. Daniel's flashlight flickered. For one heartbeat, the figure of Eleanor, or something wearing her shape, was perched on the edge of the bed. Just a shadow, just a blur, and then gone. The room fell silent again, but Daniel did not move. He dared not blink. Every instinct told him to run, but he remained, trapped in place by the certainty that something remained unseen. And in that oppressive silence, he realized the undeniable truth. The room was alive. Not with life, but with the echo of what had once been. And it was waiting for him. Daniel's legs felt like lead as he hovered at the threshold of room 6B. Every instinct screamed for him to step back, retreat to the relative safety of the nurse's station, pretend none of this had happened. But some unseen force, call it morbid curiosity, call it duty, call it fear, kept him rooted in place. The faint green glow from the monitor pulsed erratically, painting long shadows that twisted across the walls. He inched forward, each step deliberate, barely audible against the linoleum. The air had grown colder, thickening with a damp, metallic scent that made his stomach churn. He could feel it pressing against his skin, settling into the hollow of his neck, into his lungs with every shallow breath. The bed. It was the focus of his dread. The sheets, once neatly tucked, now bore the impression of someone recently there. The pillow had a faint indentation, the mattress sagged under an invisible weight. Daniel's eyes darted from the monitor to the bed, trying to convince himself it was exhaustion, an optical illusion, a trick of light and shadow. But every rational thought fell away as a faint, broken sob echoed from the corner behind the bed. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to step closer. The monitor flickered violently, and in one staccato burst of light, he saw her, Eleanor. Or rather, the outline of her, seated upright, ghostly yet horrifyingly tangible. Her head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on him. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but a weightless, unbearable accusation. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded so violently he swore it would burst through his chest. He wanted to run, wanted to slam the door shut and never look back, but his legs refused to obey. His rational mind screamed, but his body remained rooted, trapped between disbelief and terror. The whisper came next, soft at first, then layering into a chorus of unintelligible syllables. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel staggered backward, hands shaking, gripping the doorframe like a lifeline. His flashlight trembled in his other hand, casting narrow beams that made the shadows dance across the walls. The room seemed alive, breathing, pulsing with unseen energy. The sheets shifted once more, the pillows sinking as though someone had just sat back down. He tried to rationalize. The ghost of grief lingering, electrical interference, hallucination induced by exhaustion. But none of these explanations held weight in the presence of undeniable, visceral wrongness. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Daniel's gaze locked on the figure. Every flicker of light painted her closer, every strobe revealed her more vividly. Her lips moved, though no sound escaped at first. Then, overlapping with the monitor's erratic beeping, came the voice. You left me here." It was Eleanor's tone, unmistakable, though warped and layered with something else, something inhuman. Daniel's knees buckled, his body trembling uncontrollably. His eyes darted to the monitor, the heartbeat line, steady at first, then spiking erratically, then flatlining, then rebounding again in rhythm with the whispers. The shadows in the room coalesced. Light and dark became indistinguishable. The mattress sank deeper under invisible weight. Daniel felt a cold brush against his cheek, an almost human exhale that left goosebumps along his spine. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping, and his flashlight clattered to the floor. The beam spun wildly, illuminating fragments of the room. A chair angled toward the bed, the crumpled sheets, the monitor flickering green. Then, in one violent burst of light from the failing fluorescence, he saw her fully. Eleanor, seated upright, eyes wide, staring directly at him. Her mouth opened in a scream that made no sound, yet the room vibrated with it, pressing into Daniel's chest, rattling his bones. The whispers multiplied, a cacophony of grief and accusation, layering over the sobs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Daniel's rationality shattered. He pressed himself flat against the wall, unable to move, unable to tear his gaze away. The mattress sagged again, pillow shifting. The chair leaned forward as if someone invisible had perched there. The air vibrated with the faint exhale of 1,000 breaths. Then suddenly silence. The fluorescent light steadied. The room appeared empty. Sheets smooth, pillow undisturbed, monitor dark. Daniel's body shook violently, lungs burning, heart hammering. He didn't dare breathe. Every muscle screamed to leave, yet he stayed, trapped in place by the undeniable certainty that the room was still occupied. And in the suffocating quiet, he realized a truth he could not deny. It was waiting. Not angry, not sad, but watching. Patient, silent, relentless. He slowly backed into the hallway, chest heaving, until the door closed behind him with a faint, final click. Even as he reached the nurse's station, he could feel it. The weight of the room, the gaze of the departed, pressing into his back, reminding him that some presences never leave. If you were Daniel, standing in that hallway with the room behind you, would you dare return? Or would you accept that some doors should never be opened? The fluorescent hum of the hallway settled into a low, oppressive vibration as Daniel leaned against the wall outside room 6B. His lungs burned from rapid breathing, and his hands were slick with cold sweat. The hallway lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, but he knew the room behind him hadn't truly returned to normal. It never did. Daniel's mind raced, trying to reconstruct the events. The whispers, the sobbing, the impossible sight of Eleanor, sitting upright despite her death. He ran through every rational explanation. Exhaustion, hallucination, equipment malfunction, residual grief. But none accounted for the undeniable physical impressions. The sagging mattress, the pillow that had shifted, the chair angled toward the bed. He had felt it, the invisible weight, the presence pressing against him. He took a tentative step back, glancing over his shoulder. The door to room 6B was still closed. Perfectly, impossibly closed. Not a crack. Not a hint of movement. The hallway stretched out before him in sterile, unchanging symmetry, and yet every shadow now seemed to stretch longer, darker, leaning toward him with intent. He approached the nurse's station, shaking, trying to gather his thoughts. Colleagues had begun trickling in for their early shifts, blinking sleep from their eyes. They saw his pale, rigid form and the trembling hands clutching his clipboard. "Daniel, are you okay?" one asked. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, but the words lodged in his throat. How could he explain what had just transpired? A room that should be empty, a patient long gone and yet alive, or something taking the shape of life, haunting its familiar corner. He shook his head slowly. "No," he whispered finally, voice barely audible. "Not okay." He typed something into the incident log anyway, careful to leave the wording as neutral as possible. Checked room 6B. No anomalies noted. Patient vacated. But he knew the log was a lie. Not a deliberate one, but a lie to protect himself, because if he wrote the truth, he feared no one would understand. For the next few nights, Daniel avoided the wing. Every time he walked past room 6B, his pulse quickened, his stomach tightened. He told himself he was imagining things, that maybe the shadows played tricks. But deep down he knew it wasn't imagination. The weight of unseen eyes, the faint dragging beneath the bed, the whispering, none of that could be fabricated by exhaustion alone. He tried to distract himself, taking longer rounds, focusing on charts, talking to patients in other wings, yet the memory of that room clung to him. Sometimes he'd hear a faint sob or whisper echoing in his mind, indistinguishable from reality, until he blinked and realized the hallway was still empty. The staff eventually admitted what Daniel had suspected. Others had felt it too. A shadow in the corner of their vision, equipment mysteriously turning on, the faint impression of a body where none should be. Room 6B had a history. Not just Eleanor. Previous patients, nurses, doctors, all had reported similar experiences over decades, hushed conversations, notes in private journals. Yet management refused to acknowledge it officially. The room remained sealed at night. Maintenance refused entry. Security logs showed nothing unusual. Yet those who had worked late shifts for years knew it was safer to avoid the wing entirely once the lights dimmed. Daniel returned once, unable to resist the pull of his own curiosity. He pressed his hand to the door, feeling the chill seep through the metal, the air heavy with a presence just beyond comprehension. And in that instant, he swore he heard it. A faint whisper, a familiar tone beckoning him closer. He jumped back, chest tight, and ran down the hallway, heart hammering like a drum. The door shut behind him with a soft click. The wing was silent again, but Daniel knew better. He could feel it lingering, watching, waiting. The next morning, he tried to rationalize what had happened, telling himself it was exhaustion, grief, or some unexplainable neurological response. But the memory of her gaze, the blank, accusing eyes staring into his soul, refused to fade. It gnawed at him, leaving a hollow sensation behind his sternum, a reminder that some rooms carry their own truths. Daniel never walked past room 6B the same way again. He learned to angle his steps toward the opposite wall, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor, pretending not to notice the shadow pooling under the doorframe. Even when he transferred off the night shift, even when weeks passed without stepping foot in that wing, the memory clung to him like the faint smell of antiseptic that never quite left his clothes. Still, at odd moments he'd see it in his mind, the pale glow of the monitor blinking steady and patient, the sag of the untouched mattress as though someone unseen still rested there, and the whisper, barely more than breath, curling into the silence. It wasn't imagination. He knew that now. What unsettled him most wasn't the sound, or even the sensation of being watched. It was the certainty that room 6B had chosen him. It had noticed him. And things like that, he realized, don't simply stop when you clock out of a shift. They follow. They wait. Years later, after he'd left St. Augustine entirely, others began to share their stories. A nurse swore she'd seen the shape of someone sitting upright in the bed long after the room had been sealed. An orderly confessed that she heard the sound of weeping whenever she wheeled carts past the door. Some said it was the spirit of a patient who had died there. Others claimed it was something far older, something that fed on the sorrow of hospitals and chose room 6B as its nest. Whatever the truth, one thing became undeniable: the West Wing was never empty. Not at night. Not ever. And even now, if you walk those halls at 3 a.m., you might feel it for yourself. The cold breath against your neck, the heaviness pressing down on your chest, the certainty that something inside that locked room knows you're there. So I'll leave you with this. If you stood before that door, hand trembling against the handle, would you dare to push it open? Or would you keep walking knowing some doors are closed for a reason? This was tonight's story, drawn from the dark halls of mind's abyss. If you've ever felt the weight of silence pressing in, or wondered what lingers in places where the living and the dead cross paths, you know you're not alone. Every night, new true horror stories echo here. So if you haven't yet, subscribe and return tomorrow for another tale that won't let you sleep. Until then, stay out of the dark wings and never ignore the whispers.